number 20, which is recreational clam, sand crab, and shrimp gear emergency. And we have Susan Ashcraft again leading this item.
Thank you, President Silva. Today's item is to discuss and consider adopting emergency regulations to prohibit use of hydraulic pump gear for recreational take of clams, as well as for sand crab and shrimp. By way of background, back in June of 2019, the Commission received a regulation change petition to ban the use of hand-operated hydraulic pump gear for the taking of gaper clam and other clams, based on concerns with the gear type's efficiency and increased use. The Commission referred the petition to the Department for review and recommendation, and in February of 2020, based on the Department's recommendation, the Commission granted the petition for consideration in a future rulemaking. Note that a timeline was not identified at that time. I'd also note that that was just immediately preceding the stay-at-home order that was issued the subsequent month, and some of the increases in recreational tide pool activities that the department and the public has reported on subsequent to that. Fast forward to December 2019, at your meeting, the department reported that dramatic increases in recreational clamming efforts were occurring in general, and also increases in the harvest using hydraulic hand pumps. They believed that immediate action was necessary to protect the stock, and in response, the Commission approved scheduling this agenda item as an emergency rulemaking. Today, the department will provide an overview of what it proposes and include additions that are summarized in your staff report that the department will cover for inclusion in the emergency rulemaking. I'd like to note that the Commission received 10 public comments, which are summarized in your binder. 8 of the comments were in support of the proposed ban, provided that it would not inadvertently prevent the continued use of non-hydraulic pumps that are used above the low tide. And we have confirmed the language as written would not impact that gear. 2 fishermen that harvest clam in Tomales Bay using hydraulic pumps opposed the gear ban. I note that they had reached out when the original petition came out with concerns about the petition. They suggest some alternative methods that could be explored. So there may be potential opportunity for potential follow-up while any emergency action is in effect, should the Commission request the department to provide an update on its effort to review during a future meeting. I now turn over the floor to Ian Kelmartin, who's an environmental scientist with the department's Marine Region, for the presentation.
Thanks, Susan. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you, commissioners, for making time to address this emergency issue that the department has identified. I'm with the Invertebrate Management Program, part of the Marine Region of the department. Today, we'll be discussing this emergency regulation to prohibit the use of hydraulic pumps in the recreational clam, sand crab, and shrimp fishery. The concern mostly comes from the clam fishery, so we'll spend the bulk of our time on that topic and discuss the sand crabs and shrimp towards the end. Next slide, please. We'll first talk briefly about clam biology and some background in the fishery, then discuss the pump and the issues it's caused, followed by our proposed emergency regulation and the next steps. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this regulation will apply to all clam species, but the main species of concern are gaper clams. There's two closely related species along the California coast. You'll see a gaper clam on your right-hand side. That caliper shows about 6.5 inches across the shell. So these can be quite, they can grow quite large. They're managed with Washington clams, which include the Washington and butter clam. Next slide, please. These species inhabit protected marine waters from the intertidal zone to 100 feet or more in depth. They're broadcast spawners, and after a free swimming period, the larvae settle on the bottom, and over the course of several years, they'll bury themselves 1 to 2 feet in the substrate, sometimes deeper, 3 to 4 feet, depending exactly on the habitat. They'll become mature at 3 years old, have a maximum age of about 20, and can weigh up to 5 pounds. They filter feed through the siphons that you'll see on the right-hand side. The upper image is a picture of the siphon poking up through the sea floor. And then the lower image is a clam that's been dug up and is resting on the sea floor. And you can really see the size of the siphon compared to the rest of the clams. Next slide, please. They're highly valued as a food item. Right now, there's only a recreational fishery for clams, although there is a commercial fishery in Humboldt Bay that's been inactive for at least the past 20 years. Fisheries open year-round. The gaper clams and Washington clams are managed together over most of the state. The bag limits are 10 gaper clams and 10 Washington clams per day, though those are larger in Humboldt Bay and Elkhorn Slough. Harvesters must retain each clam that they dig until they reach their limit, and then they must stop harvesting. And until recently, these species were typically harvested with shovels, rakes, and some other hand-operated gear types. On the right-hand side, you can see a typical scene of folks harvesting clams from an exposed bed at a very low tide. You need about less than half a foot above the mean lower low water to harvest clams, and you'll see that there's exposed sand and folks digging with shovels. Next slide, please. So now we'll discuss the hydraulic pumps. Next slide, please. The picture on the right is a typical example of one of these pumps. They're usually homemade, so they can vary a little bit in appearance, but their function is common. On the yellow circle shows a water inlet hole. The T-shaped handle at the top is pumped up and down like a bicycle pump, and that expels pressurized water through that flexible black hose and through the rigid white nozzle there. That nozzle is directed into the substrate and liquefies the sediment around the clam to allow the harvester to simply reach down and pull the clam up. These are often used in teams of 2. And I just want to take a second here. Susan alluded to it, but what this is not is a gear type that's often known as a clam gun or a slurp gun or a shrimp gun, which uses suction to remove clams and sediment from the seafloor. Next slide, please. And you can go ahead and play that video. So what we see here is 2 teams of 2 people harvesting clams. There's 2 folks pumping, and then near their feet are folks that are working the nozzle and extracting clams. And what you'll also note here is that the clam bed is still submerged in water, which will become important in our next point. Next slide, please. These were first noticed in about the past half decade and have rapidly risen in popularity to the point where it's estimated that 80 to 90% of folks engaged in clam harvesting in Tomales Bay use use these gear type. The photo on the bottom was taken on January 9th, 2021 at Tamales Bay. It's taken through scope, so it's a little difficult to see, but that's about 15 people, and I count between 6 and 9 hydraulic pumps between them. It's understandable why this gear has been adopted so rapidly. It makes it faster and easier to harvest clams than digging with the shovel. You're less likely to damage the clam when you're harvesting it with this hydraulic pump. It also increases the time before and after low tide clams are available to harvest, and also the area that's available to harvest clams, because this pump can be used when the beds are still submerged. Now, we typically manage fisheries based on the traditional harvest methods, and the rapid adoption of this gear has led to a significant change in how the fishery is prosecuted by their participants, and that's led to some concerns among the public and the department. Next slide, please. Next slide. There's two main areas of concern that we have around these pumps. As I described in the previous slide, they really do increase the efficiency of harvesters. Creel surveys in 2018 showed us that participants using hydraulic pumps to harvest clams were more successful in achieving limits than folks that were using more traditional gear types, shovel and the like. And we've also noted in the past several years increased participation in the fishery. We believe that started in 2018 with the closure of the abalone fishery, and that some of that effort may have shifted over to clams. And then just this past year, there's been a very large spike in participation that we believe fits in with a trend of folks increasingly taking advantage of outdoor recreation opportunities because of COVID. In fact, the department saw an almost 20% increase in resident annual license sales in 2020 over 2019. Between the increased participation and the increased depth that participants are able to access with these guns, we're also concerned with increased disturbance of eelgrass beds. Next slide, please. The second area of concern for us comes around law enforcement. There's been an increase in citations for over limits and high grading in association with the use of these pumps. Wardens have observed groups which unearth the clams and leave them submerged underwater, sitting on the seabed, retain only the largest clams as part of their limits, and leave the smaller clams exposed. They're unable to rebury themselves, so the clams then succumb either to predation or exposure. The law enforcement staff believe that much of this activity could be related to illegal commercial sale of gaper clams. A group trafficking in gaper clams was convicted in 2019, and it's suspected that there are additional groups trafficking in these animals. An additional enforcement concern is that much of this illegal activity can be concealed underwater using these pumps, which makes enforcement very difficult.